We're joined today by Professor Emeritus Salim Mansur of Western University. Hi, Salim.
Hi, Robert.
And we're gathered here today to talk about a piece of news that appeared in the National Post on the 19th of the resignation or the retirement of Jordan Peterson, Dr. Jordan Peterson, University of Toronto, who was a tenured professor who had fully planned to, as he said, basically he wanted to work until they dragged his skeleton out of the university. But for a couple of reasons, he decided to quit early, and he is now Professor Emeritus, as are you, Salim, which is a distinguished title given to professors who have superannuated and who have made a name for themselves at the university. So good for him in one respect, bad in that it's an indictment of the universities and of our culture altogether, because there's two reasons he resigned. The first, in a nutshell, is that he laments the fact that he knows that his straight, white, male students will go nowhere in academia because of what's called D.I.E, diversity, inclusivity, and equity, which is the new woke philosophy that only blacks, indigenous people, and people of color are to be hired at a disproportionate amount over the demographics of the country. For example, Canada is about 75% white, English, French, white. And yet you might find 3% Chinese, but those will get preference as they are people of color. They will get preference over all of the 75% of the country. And so he laments that, the destruction of the university, especially the treatment of white male heterosexuals. And his second reason for resigning is that when you promote based on color, on race, on ethnicity, you're going to inevitably get, as he said, a generation of researchers utterly unqualified. And he couldn't be part of that system. So Salim, yourself, I know that you've had personal issues with your university, University of Western Ontario, and you have since retired and are Professor Emeritus. I've been a victim of the university's campus, the student union there at UWO, who canceled Just Right over political differences. And so we're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing it everywhere. And there's this one man, Jordan Peterson, who's had enough of it and is not going to take it anymore. What are your thoughts on Jordan Peterson's early retirement, Salim?
Well, Jordan Peterson letter or op-ed that came out last week on National Post telling not only Canadians, but just about everyone around the world who pay attention to these matters, why he decided to resign and retire from his position as a full tenured professor at University of Toronto in the Department of Psychology. Jordan, over the past several years, had become possibly the best known academic intellectual in Canada, and his name had spread beyond Canada around the world. So he's a well-published author, highly respected in terms of his own work and his personality. And so he had many more years to go in the university if he had decided to remain in the university. But he saw the headlines, the message that was coming down the pipe, and he chose to leave the university so that he could do his own work. What it means is, apart from Jordan's own cry de coeur, in a sense, it was a cry from his heart, letting the world know what is happening in the ivory towers in Canada, and I think around the Western world, particularly in the Anglosphere. what is happening, to let the world know about it. And so what it is that led him to do that, he explains it. The university is no longer a place, I would say for quite some time now, is no longer a place for what the university's purpose was when it was created way back when you might go back to, England in the 13th, 14th, 15th century onward. The whole idea was the university would be one place, one environment in the society where people could pursue their study, their intellectual activity, their research, their discussions and writing and so on and so forth, in just all field of human endeavor, free from any political or religious interference. And that would be something that would be protected in the sense that no one would be in any way brought to answer the powers to be of the day and their demands, that they would be free to critique, to think, to write, to question within the university's constitution and the constitution of a democratic society such as ours. But that is no longer the case. Universities have become, in fact, the first ground of politicization, universities, colleges, and school. And it is this politicization that is producing the whole generations of people in Canada, the United States, in the Anglosphere, who are coming out of the universities with ideas and values and approaches to life that is contrary to everything that the universities were meant to be, that is the islands of freedom and liberty for people to pursue these matters. And that is being shut down or has shut down. And the people coming out of there are politicized people. I mean, when he talks about DIE, what is it? Diversity, inclusivity, and equity, that everyone in the university has to follow the prescription laid out in this formula. And if they don't, they will pay certainly a big price. Means that people like Jordan Peterson, in my case, when I was in the university, we couldn't speak and write and do things freely without being threatened in some ways, either in terms of our own career going forward, or in terms of legal actions being brought to bear upon us within the university. I mean, you mentioned my own situation. My situation, this was several years ago, before my retirement. In fact, it was a few years after 9/11 that from within the university, it was not from outside the university, it was from within the university culture, university environment, that a professor from Waterloo Department of Engineering, who was heading this organization that had been created in Canada by a number of people of Muslim background called Canadian Islamic Congress. This professor, Professor Muhammad al-Masri, wrote to the university, my dean and my university president, indicating that they should fire me from my position, remove me from the university, from the faculty, because I was, in terms of my writing, I was engaged, as he defined it, hate speech, and that his organization would be bringing hate speech charges against me for writing about Islamists, which I had been writing. I've written books. I've talked about them in my book called Multiculturalism, and subsequently the other book that I published, The Quran Problem, and series of essays published in both academic journals and in the media on the problems of Islamism after 9/11. And so that's what they threaten legal notice, just as they did in bringing hate speech indictments from the Human Rights Tribunal against Mark Stein and Ezra Levant, who were taken into court. So that was the charge that was brought against me. My president and my dean at that time both basically turned them down, saying that I am a tenured professor and that I have the right to pursue my work freely and that I was within my constitutional rights to speak and write what I wanted to say on matters such as what I was writing about, the politics of the Middle East and Islamism. So in that time, this was about 15 years ago, I was protected. But I think what has happened in the period since then, situation has become far more bleak and grim. And the result we see now with Jordan Peterson, who has refused to live by the code that has been formulated by the politician, by the parliament, on how to address use pronouns in terms of gender politics and transgender identity and identity politics, and on the question, as you mentioned, D.I.E, D.I.E, what is coming down the pipe, that is the hiring process of what is now the acronym BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, and what that means for students of people like Jordan Peterson, that he, as he wrote, can no longer, with any degree of integrity, prepare his students, especially his graduate students coming in, for a career in the university, knowing fully well that they will not qualify under the new rules that are being set in place, you know. And what in effect this is, basically, Robert, is university is no longer the ground for merit. It is a ground for politically correct hiring process, politically correct education, politically correct promotions, and so on and so forth. And in that environment, you know, people who care about what universities were and designed to be, places of freedom and free research, unimpeded by political consideration, can no longer work.
There's something interesting that Peterson said in his letter in the National Post, and it's something that you and I have talked about before, and that is that politics is downstream of culture. But Peterson properly identifies that culture is also downstream from ideas. Ideas expressed normally in university, but they can come from other places, just like somebody publishing a book. But generally that is the case, is that the ideas that happen at the university level trickle down throughout the culture. And you can take, for example, philosophers like a John Dewey, whose ideas were embraced, and then you saw the destruction of education. Or you have Karl Marx writing a book. People gather to that kernel of what they consider to be truth, and the result is 100 million people dead and societies destroyed. So when Peterson talks about culture being downstream from these universities, he's painting a pretty bleak future for our culture if everybody is going to be considered based on their race and ethnicity and their color. It's pure racism. And it's not ironic, I guess, that Peterson, who's very steeped in Soviet history, Soviet Union history, has said that, he quoted from a Putin speech. And in Putin says that we went through all of this nonsense just after 1917 and the revolution, you know, where people were judged based on political favor. So what does this portend for the culture of Canada and the West when you have people like Peterson just resigning giving this canary in the coal mine warning to everybody that worse is about to happen. What do you think?
Well, what I think is all of this that is happening and we are observing and witnessing, and Peterson is a data point, a very big data point in this decline that we are witnessing, is not something that is of recent vintage. This had a long process, and it began long before Peterson and I came into the universities. You know, we can go back. I'm talking about a long process in Western democracies. Yeah, as you mentioned, Soviet Union has gone through this process as a result of the revolution of 1917, the communist revolution, and they came out of it in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Chinese are going through their own communist state, you know, the revolution that came in 49, and then the establishment of the communist system. And within that, they've gone through horrendous period of cultural revolution, control, and so on and so forth. And it's not over. It is a totalitarian state. Other countries have had a similar experience in the 20th century. I mean, most notably, the case of Germany. You know, one of the countries and culture of Europe that was at the seat, at the heart of the process of enlightenment, reformation, counter-reformation, and enlightenment that brings about the modern world. And then Germany in the 20th century, you know, went into that phase of history, the totalitarian phase under the Nazi Germany, and the universities were again the fertile ground for the spread of totalitarian ideas for the totalitarian party, the fascist party that was the party of Hitler, Nazi, National Socialist Party, Workers' Party, same thing, universities and colleges and schools in former Soviet Union. That became again the fertile grounds for the spreading of the ideas, totalitarian ideas of control and power in China. And so what we're seeing is those societies that Peterson mentions in his op-ed, The Voice of Vladimir Putin, saying, you know, what is happening? We went through all of this. We were burned, we were destroyed, we came out, and now we are seeing this happening in the West. What it tells us, you know, here we are, you and I, we are talking in this period of pandemic, fake pandemic, real pandemic, whatever it is in the sense, but the idea that a virus that emerged from a Wuhan lab in China went global and infected a whole lot of people. And we are still dealing with the aftermath of that. Well, that's it. Ideas go global. Totalitarian idea did not die out. Totalitarian idea came into the West. Or one might say the ideas of Marx and Lenin and Mao didn't remain confined to the society in which their ideas played out, the drama of those society in terms of, you know, the way politics was arranged and implemented. Those ideas got exported. Those ideas came across oceans into our society. And here we are, you know, basically repeating what other people have already paid a huge price for. And what does that tell us? That we people have to go through the experience ourselves if you're going to get out of that experience. You know, I mean, it is one of the ironies or paradoxes. You know, learning from history book doesn't matter. It is people themselves have to experience it, and that's what is happening. University of Toronto, that's where Jordan Peterson is, from where he has resigned and left. That's the university that I went to for my studies. And there was in that university, I sat and listened to the lectures that became a book by Alan Bloom. That was, you know, 2 generations ago in the 1970s. the closing of the American mind. And Bloom was talking about what was happening in the universities, 2 generations before his time. That is the process by which we were narrowing our education under not some imposition at that time by governments. It was being done by the institution itself. That is, a sort of political correctness was coming into play in the 1950s and 60s in the universities, in the colleges, to set up what is legitimate, what is not legitimate, what is right, what is not right. That, again, back to political correctness, controlled speech, and formulating the code to implement those controlled speech within the university environment. And that was the closing of the American mind that Alan Bloom talked about and then subsequently published. So the critical point here, Robert, is that the issue that came into play was that if you look at the world, and we were looking at the world from, of course, the place where we were sitting, or we are sitting, America, Canada, Britain. If you look at the world is a tremendously problematic place in terms of class, in terms of race, in terms of ethnicity. The whole idea of equality is an idea, is an abstraction, but in the real world, there is no such thing as everyone is equal in any sense of perfection, absoluteness. And it cannot be unless it is imposed upon, because we are all come with different capability and different capacity and different interests. So it is about equality in terms of equal treatment under the law. But the notion of equality, of imposing equality, became something that was being driven by the post-1945 world. After the Second World War, there was the breakout of retreat of colonial powers. I mean, after the war, as they retreated and new states came into being, independence in India, independence of African states, independence of states in the Caribbean, and so on and so forth. These states became independent, but they were certainly not economically equal in any form or shape, and all the other standards of measure with the European powers, with United States, with Canada. And within these societies themselves, after 1945, there was a burst of demand for equality coupled with freedom. And of course, in the United States, the demand was for racial equality, black and white. And elsewhere, there were similar demands in terms of their own social arrangement. In Canada, we did not have that much, but as more and more of these discussion filtered through our educational system, people were raising questions. Most were legitimate questions. In Canada, the issue was about, French and English. And Canada went through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, immense political turmoil on the question of French in Canada. And then subsequently came the question of the Indigenous people. And with that came the question of immigration and new immigrants coming into Canada. And so the question of equality was, what does equality mean? And how can equality be brought about? And those questions were raised, of course, in the university, which is where it has to be raised. But the long and the short of it is, the universities and colleges and schools are the educational institution. The people who eventually run a society. In politics, people who become elected as members of parliament, members of provincial legislatures, and so on and so forth, in municipal governments and local cities, people who go into politics, people who go into business, people who go into media, whatever profession they go into, they're prepared in the university, right? In the colleges. That's the institution where the education questioning, thinking emerges from. And so what we have today, people in the university, people in politics, in government, in business, in the corporate world, in any institution, in churches, they are the products of universities and colleges where they were educated. And so this process began, as I said, after Second World War. It's a long process. It's now almost 80 years, and these questions were debated and discussed. In the United States, the civil rights movement led to massive changes in terms of public policy discussion in the media and in government. But the place where it began was in the university. And so, for instance, affirmative action, to provide for, some sort of compensation for what had happened to the Blacks in America in a slave society, and to give them, in that sense, a leg up, so to speak, affirmative action, so that they could catch up and move forward, in a way that they would need special attention or special arrangements, and that was provided for. But taking that affirmative action issue, which began in the 1960s, in the case of America with the Blacks, in the case of Canada, as immigration proceeded on in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that is not officially affirmative action, but opening up the institution to see that there is representation of new Canadians of different ethnic backgrounds apart from white Caucasians, English or French. Universities were the ground, colleges and universities were the ground where those ideas and issues came into play. But then what was a fair discussion, in many ways a necessary and a required discussion, turned into politics and political action and policies. In Canada, that was multiculturalism. In the 1970s, multiculturalism was enunciated by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and now multiculturalism is right in our Charter of Rights and Freedom, that all policies in some ways have to be refracted through the lens of multiculturalism. And what we have spoken about this. What does multiculturalism mean? What does affirmative action mean in America, which is where they have struggling with this? We are struggling with the issue of multiculturalism now that it has become a public policy. The shift was from a society based upon the idea of individual freedom, individual rights, to the idea in society of trying to create the basis of equality, not in terms of individuals, but in terms of group identity. You're not being identified as an individual, whether you are from a person of Caucasian background, white person, or you are, say, a Chinese Canadian of Chinese background, an Indian background, a person from Caribbean background that is Black, or brown person, so on and so forth. It is an identity politics that become, which is a group identity, not an individual identity. And the gradual shift from individual to group identity, and to make greater and greater space and allowance and support for that group-based identity in a world of zero-sum relationship, it led to the diminution of that individual identity, which means individual merit, which is what Jordan Peterson is talking about, merit. So if you have two persons competing for a position, or the university department has a list of potential people to hire from, in which the people are on one side, a number of people who are white Caucasian, and then on the other side, a number of people defined in terms of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and the public policy has been established in the university is diversity, inclusion, and equity. Then the departmental heads and the university administrators and college administrators, based upon those considerations, is going to weigh in favor of the requirements of D.I.E and BIPOC, rather than on the requirements of the individual merit of the person. Let's assume in the best situation, the ideal situation, that of the two candidates, one a white Caucasian and one a person of BIPOC, that on terms of merit, both are excellent candidates. Now, where will the decision fall upon? The university demands D.I.E and BIPOC. And so the decision will fall to hire the person with the right political consideration rather than on merit consideration. Now, in this ideal position, you might say that, yeah, we are in that sense, a multi-ethnic or multicultural, or in the case of America, Black and white, the history of slavery and so on. So there has to be some sort of a compensation. And it is too bad that, that the white, in this case, the majority population, feel that they're being discriminated against, and a person of color is given the opportunity to advance. And so that is the large historical problem that we are trying to correct within this generation. And so a lot of people might say, yeah, that's fine, we'll go along with this. That was a situation in trying to bring about equity or equality in terms of gender relationship, male and female, and so a little more compensation was made in or weighting was done in favor of female candidates, whether it is in politics and corporate world, business world, so on and so forth, that we have seen happen. But when this matter becomes politicized in a way, which is what is happening with us right now, that just about all the problems that we are faced with in both domestically in our own individual society and globally in the world, that these problems are a consequence of the dominance of the white culture and the white civilization, and that therefore, in some ways, they now have to pay to correct the imbalances and inequities. And when that is politicized, then the paradox has been completed. A society that has fought for equality on the basis of individual and who they are in terms of individual. Freedom means nothing if it doesn't mean individual rights. That society then has now gone full circle into bringing in the basis of weighing all of these various options on terms of group and collective identities, which means racism, and that's where we are headed into. We are headed into fully under the name of multiculturalism, under the name of critical race theory, into becoming a society that discriminates with the full sanction of the authority of the government and the law against individual in favor of group, and
I have an anecdote of my own, very similar to Peterson's in one sense. I was a school trustee on the public school board in London, Ontario. And this is back around the year 2000, something like that, 99, 98, 97. And at that time, the administration told the school board in camera, means behind closed doors, that from now on, all vice principals will be women, will be chosen from, the candidates will be women. And I said, that's disgusting. And I had a sit down with the superintendent, privately with him and another trustee, to just make sure that we heard what we heard right. And he confirmed it. He says, from now on, all the vice principals, new vice principals, will be women. I said, don't you realize that the principals are chosen from the vice principal pool? Superintendents are chosen from the principal pool. So what you're going to end up with in due course is that all positions of authority in the public education system in the City of London will be women. Men need not apply. And I broke confidentiality and I went to the press about it. That caused a lot of consternation, I can tell you that. But I basically had to do what Jordan Peterson did and go public and say, look, men, you're not welcome in the school board, City of London. Because you'll never advance. You will not advance by their own admission. And it's a double-edged sword, Salim, because not only do the men will be discriminated against actively based on their gender, but the women will be advanced. And how are they supposed to feel that knowing that, or maybe not knowing, that they got their position of authority based on their gender, on their sex? What does that do to one's self-esteem? Not just for the men, but for the women. And same with BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And I don't know why they say people of color, because whatever. Non-white, why don't they just say non-white? What does that do to the self-esteem, if they have any, of those people who advance in the universities based on their race and ethnicity? I personally don't think I would want to belong to that kind of an organization, and good for Jordan Peterson for walking away, because it's a reprehensible, disgusting philosophy to hire based on physical characteristics. And this is the destruction of society. You're absolutely right. And the way that the universities permeate all aspects of our life, from your doctors to your nurses to your teachers to your, you name it. Almost everybody now has to have a university education. And when you go through that university education, you are now, if you are a person of integrity, ironically forced to lie to get your diploma, to get your degree, to advance in academia. You have to lie, unless you actually believe this D.I.E. nonsense, in which case you'd be telling the truth. But as Peterson said, all these people have to, if you're going to apply for a grant, have to explain how you're going to implement your diversity, inclusivity, and equity program. If you have a paper to write, you have to basically include BIPOC in it. I mean, if you're in Hollywood and you have a play that you're writing, it has to have BIPOC in its makeup. This is absolutely disgusting, and how we as a society put up with it, I don't know. And Putin is absolutely right. Maybe after he's finished invading Ukraine, he can invade Canada too and probably set things right here.
Well, what you are saying, Robert, is an expression about the outrage that you are expressing, and I feel the same outrage. And Jordan Peterson has not only felt the outrage, he has taken step. He resigned from his position, which rarely, very few people do. I don't know to what extent any of his colleagues are going to take a position in some ways similar to Jordan. I doubt it very much. But the point that you're raising, the outrage that you have expressed, is again, ironically, people who think about these matters, It is not something that is across the spectrum of our society. And the example that you raise, given what you had experienced being on the Board of Education as a trustee in London, Ontario, going back some 20 years. So you see, we're talking not something that began recently, 20 years, but that was a preparation that another 20 years before was happening, before it came to the situation where you confronted that, sitting on the table around with other Board of Trustees, being told that only women will be hired. And then the question that you asked, what do the women think about this? Those who are in these positions, who have been hired in this position going forward. And my answer is they don't think about it. In general, I'm talking about generically. They won't think about it, because in the education system, they have imbibed. That's where the education institution deals with ideas. They teach their children, the students who are children, and then who, going forward in time, they become the leaders of the society in the various professions they are in. So you're talking now about the teachers. They imbibe the whole idea, theory that had germs of truth in it, going back to early 20th century, the whole movement of suffragettes, voting rights, women in the workforce, women want in the workforce with equality of wages, and so on and so forth. So in this study, the thing what they imbibe was that to be a woman is to be handicapped in a male dominant society.
They're treating them like children.
And so politics is about power at the end of the day, and then what you do with that power. So as women comes into the workforce, women are educated, women are voters, they are going to exercise their right as women, just as men have done. And so in their exercise of the right, the policies emerge, the policies that henceforth you're going to only hire women so that some sort of a semblance of equality is reached in the profession. And maybe once you've hired enough women, that a sense of equality has been received, the dynamics, the momentum has already set, that more women will be hired and men will become the minority, and the men will have to make the fight to reach that equality, just as the women did. But the point here is that I'm driving at, that no women are going to, or very few women are going to spend a sleepless night thinking that they got a position that they got was just because of their gender, and that was unfair. That by getting the position that they got and they were hired for, they then deprived another person who happened to be a male, who might have had better qualification, but because I, the woman, was one of the applicants, I got the job. I don't think too many women will spend a sleepless night over it, just as not too many blacks in America or indigenous or people of color would spend sleepless night over these questions. And that's what we see that has happened right across the society. One is that in the education process, in these discussions where the ideas are played out at the college and high school, college, and university, the majority population, we're now talking about North America, United States and Canada, the majority population is white Caucasian. And that education, those questions, which begins the closing of, in Bloom's word, the American mind, the Canadian mind, that is the closing in the sense of political correctness. We are moving away from the issue, what was in a sense that as a society, we took for granted, that is freedom meant individual rights. Equality meant equality, but based under the law, merit. between individuals. So that window was closing, because now the window that was opening, that this window was closing because it was described as, represented as, basically in so many ways as unjust, unfair, exploitative of those who, in a sense, were seen to have been excluded based upon this window of individual rights and freedom. It was very much a window that saw the world on the basis of individual, but in North America, the individual were white, male, Caucasian, and they were the ones who were holding power, so patriarchy, etc. And that window was closing, and the other window that was opening was the window of group identity. You know, you take any issue. I mean, for instance, homosexuality. When I arrived in Canada in my very early 20s, almost going back half a century now. I'm very close to being a half a century. So in effect, I'm a Canadian, and my entire life has been here in Canada, especially the most productive part of my life, education, and then my profession. In the early 70s, homosexuality was still a crime in Canada. I remember the raids in Toronto when I was in Toronto in 1974, 75, being raided, clubs being raided to find out whether, you know, people were engaged in homosexual activities and so on and so forth. And there were outrages. And then there was a struggle. From there to where we are now in Canada, homosexuality is no longer seen through the window or the prism or what it was seen through before the 1970s, you know. So at a minimum, homosexuals were discriminated if they were publicly seen to be homosexual and they behaved as homosexual, whatever that behavior was, quote unquote. And there was a discrimination, but it is no longer, it is now mandated. So that the group identity of homosexual, the window that opened up, changed the whole way that the society is operated. And now we have same-sex marriage. We have, I mean, there is no issue about talking about, you know, what is your sexual preference and so on and so forth. But that window opened up the whole issue of where we have arrived at, transgenderism, you know, and so on and so forth. The whole alphabet soup of LGBTQ, you know, that has come around, and the arguments that are taking place over pronouns and nouns and so on. So a lot of people who belong to a certain generation do rightfully feel outraged because they have the memory of the other window within which they were operating. But 50 years mean those kids who are now in the university or in colleges as teachers and professors in their 50s and 60s, they have operated within this window. And they have looked at the other window with the perspective of that window was, as I said, repeat myself, unfair. It was exploitative. It was, you know, disproportionately ranged against the others, whatever the others was. And this is the transition we are going through. In a sense, we are almost reaching the end point of this transition. But the deeper problem that Jordan Peterson alludes to, and which is what he quotes Vladimir Putin in his op-ed, and Vladimir Putin is talking about. And there was recently a very interesting story that did not play out much in Canadian media, but it played out quite a bit in the American media, particularly in Fox, and New York Post had an article about this North Korean girl who escaped with her family, you know, a young North Korean girl. She was in her preteen years, and their family were lucky, managed to escape from North Korea, one of the last heavily totalitarian societies. into South Korea, and then into China, and then right across through China out into former Soviet Union, and now in the West. And so she arrived in the West as a young girl, and she grew up here, and she went to, or she is going to Columbia University in New York. Columbia University, one of the Ivy League universities. And she was interviewed recently about her education, and she said in so many words that she has been completely astounded to the extent to which the university education that she has been receiving and going through is close-minded, is totalitarian, is judgmental in terms about America and about American society. That is even worse in terms of political correctness than what people in North Korea have been going through. I mean, now there might be a bit of exaggeration over there, but the point that she was driving at is how, as a North Korean person of North Korean origin growing up, knowing what is totalitarian society, where your thinking, where your speaking, where your relationships are all fully controlled in every aspect, and therefore in education and in the professions that you go into and in your life, she finds something very similar happening in America. And the direction of the criticism that is made in American society about the notions of individual freedom, about the white population, that is the majority population, their relationship with the colored people, the sense of outrage that is expressed in the university against the majority population as oppressive, as racist, as bigoted, and so on, is something that she could not have believed if anybody had told her that this is what is America in North Korea, you know. So the result of this sort of education that we have gone through, where one window has been closed and another window has been opened in terms of my explanation, from freedom based upon individual rights to group identity, group politics, and the politicization of the universities to carry out the choices made by the people in power, whether it is in the business world or in the political world or in the media, leads to the following. In a very quick nutshell, when science becomes politicized, it is no longer science. Just like when religion becomes politicized, it is no longer religion, it is an inquisition. And that's what is happening. The university was one place that one would engage in questioning just about everything. Because it is through questioning that we can make our advances of knowing objectively what things are, how things operate, what is right, what is wrong, and so on and so forth. But if that cannot be done in the universities, take the case of climate change. For the last 35 years, in the universities, this notion was adopted and pushed that climate change, global warming, is a result of human activity, particularly in terms of using fossil fuel, burning CO2, right? And anybody within the university who questioned that was excluded. How was they excluded? Well, research money would not be provided to them. They could not apply for research grant to the National Science Research Council in Canada or similar councils in America, you know. Journals would not publish them, you know. That is, voices and opinions and experiments and research that went contrary to or questioned what became the establishment view that global warming based upon human activity, the burning of CO2, which is the very element of life, carbon dioxide, is causing global warming. And anybody that questioned that was going to be very subtly in the beginning, but now it is no longer subtle because now you're called a climate denier, will be excluded. And that's what we have arrived at. And so whether it is on the question of climate change, whether it's a question of transgenderism, that is where, Jordan Peterson confronted those issues, and how we speak, how we write, how we address ourselves. And any number of issues. We are right now under COVID, anyone questioning COVID, anyone questioning the treatment of COVID, anyone questioning the vaccine mandate, they are being, removed from the society, they are being branded, they are being excluded. That is where the problem is that we have arrived at. It began with something which was, one might say, pretty fair in the sense, yes, the blacks in America, on the question of civil rights movement and subsequently the desegregation of society, the providing of greater opportunities to make up for that historical injustices, that it was right, it was fair. But from there to where critical race theory led to, that all of the problems is basically the making of the white civilization as oppressive, as imperialist, as, warmongering, and so on and so forth. All of these discussions took place within the university. And 3-4 generations of people emerged from the university who are now in authority and have been in authority are the product of that teaching that was internalized. And that is what destroyed similar teaching, similar issues that destroyed Soviet Union, that turned Russia into a society that Solzhenitsyn talked about as Gulag Archipelago, or in China, cultural revolution, which basically, if you were taught wrongly, spoke wrongly, lived wrongly according to the standard that was Maoist and the Red Book, then you were made a public example of being, persecuted or prosecuted as a capitalist, incorrigible capitalists who have to be, brought to the right path through those excruciating, painful process that they set up. That's where we are arriving. That if we do not speak the right language that has been decided by the establishment, if we do not adhere to the way that the establishment says is the right code, then we will be excluded, which is where Justin Trudeau has now arrived at, that, the unvaccinated are, as he has defined them, as people, that small minority who are the troublemaker, who are the misogynist, who are the, the bigots and the bias and so on and so forth. This way of thinking that began in the universities and colleges have now arrived at the apex of our society to do to the rest of the people what the leaders want them to do. And if they don't do, then there is going to be heavy costs for them. That cost is left to the imagination. You lose your job, you lose your home, you lose your finances, you might lose your bank accounts. Who knows what else is coming down? And that's what Putin was talking about, That's what the young girl from North Korea is talking about. That's what people like myself have been talking about, because we came from societies that were based upon group identity. It was not based upon individual rights, And here we are. We've thought we had escaped from the prison of group identity and political correctness into the land where we could be who we wanted to be as individuals. And now we see the cycle turning around, that what we escaped from, the caste society in India, the society of collective thinking in the Middle East, the society of apartheid in South Africa, we are out to reproduce those societies right here in the land of freedom and the land of individual rights and freedom. That's the irony, that's the paradox.
When I went to university, 1979 onwards, I was there for like 7 years or so. I loved it. I thought of the university in the way that a person might think of a temple. To me, it was almost a religious experience, going there and seeing a library full of 1 million books. Having those great minds around me, trying to educate myself and others, I thought it was a great experience. And now, having worked at UWL, having seen what's happened to you, having seen what's happened to Dr. Peterson and others like him, I have nothing but contempt for what's happening at universities. And I only hope that the cycle comes around again before I shuffle off this mortal coil, so that I can once again revere the university system. Thank you, Salim, for your insight. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Robert.